one of my favorite talks that I ever have given. It's going to be a talk on the Shroud of Turin. And who here is not familiar with what the Shroud of Turin is? Okay. Who here is fairly familiar with it? A fair amount of people. Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll review what the Shroud of Turin is and then talk a bit about why it's significant. But before I do that, I want to share a little bit about my testimony, or at least mention what I probably talked about before, to give a sense of why this is so significant to me. Because I was raised in the church when I was actually raised Catholic. And for me, like unfortunately many Catholics, it was much more of a cultural experience instead of really understanding the richness of the church. But what happened was after my summer of my senior year, is I read through the New Testament for the first time, and it was a very dramatic experience for me. What happened was my faith went from something being just a very cultural thing, something that was very habitual, something my parents would just take me to church for, and it became very real, very dramatic. And it was like I was really starting to hear the voice of God, not in the sort of psychotic sense of hearing voices, but more in this intuitive sense that there was a God that was real and directing my life. And I was very excited. I wanted to go out and tell people about Jesus Christ and all that. And I went to MIT. And what happened was I went into MIT. I was very zealous for the faith. But unfortunately, I was very challenged my first few years there. I was challenged by a lot of the things that people are challenged about in college. I took a class from a secular perspective about the Bible, and it was just hit with lots of attacks of questions of, is the Bible historical? Is this just mythology? Did it really happen? Is the resurrection true? And it really shook my faith, and I was really surprised that there weren't other Christians that seemed to be so jarred by this that were in my class. But for me, the faith has always been more of an intellectual pursuit, at least in my early years. And I was challenged by issues of evolution, issues of the typical questions of the problem of evil in the world, evil and suffering, the Crusades, Inquisition, hypocrisy in the church, why are avocado pits so big? You know, all the kind of big questions that have haunted humanity for ages. And I remember thinking for a time that I was fairly convinced that Christianity was just a crutch. It was just psychological. I felt people were deluded. And I remember just one night praying to God, say, God, you know, if this is real, I just want to know it's true. I don't care what's true. Just show me what's true and I'll follow it. And for me, like a lot of people I know, I can be moved by things like testimonies of how God changed their life or beauty of the church or whatever. That doesn't faze me. I mean, it just doesn't do much for me. I mean, for me, I'm a scientist, so I just want the hard facts. You know, I want to see a videotape of the resurrection. I want to see stuff like that. I mean, none of this testimony stuff, that's just not going to do it. But I remember just saying, God, if you'll just show me and give me confidence of the faith, I will follow you for the rest of my life. And I thought that was a little bit of an unfair prayer, because faith is supposed to be something that's kind of blind, right? You just sort of do it. You're not supposed to have evidence for it. That was kind of the impression I had. But nevertheless, that was my prayer. What happened is that took me on a fairly extensive journey, a journey through studying history and philosophy and science and archaeology and a lot of different other pursuits. And what happened over time is God started to really direct my life in very extraordinary ways. Some of it was very intellectual. I just met incredible people that helped me through my questions in the New Testament, questions of evolution. And part of it was more just God working in my heart in different ways. And then I got involved with a great church in North Carolina, which is a sister church of ours out there. Pastor Ronnie Lewis had a huge impact in my life also. But what happened is as I was starting to come back to faith, as I was starting to gain confidence, I met a man named Dr. Alan Wanger. Next slide, please. And this is Dr. Alan Wanger. This is Alan and Mary Wanger. And they introduced me to something that's quite extraordinary. It's called the Shroud of Turin. And for those of you who are not familiar with the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Shroud just means burial cloth, and it's called the Shroud of Turin because it's in Turin, Italy. It's in a church in Turin, Italy. That's why it's called the Shroud of Turin. And they showed me some amazing evidence about the shroud. And really, what I'll talk about today is what this cloth is, because really what the cloth essentially is, it's like a videotape of the resurrection. It's as good as a videotape of the resurrection, at least from the perspective of a scientist. It's in a sense a living eyewitness of the resurrection that proves in extraordinary detail why we can have confidence in the resurrection of Christ. It's really quite amazing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a journey with me, because in a sense that's where much of my intellectual journey ended, is with the shroud. And I want to start you on that journey also, because I really believe it's one of the most extraordinary artifacts in all of history. In fact, it's something that God deliberately left behind as evidence for the resurrection, almost like a calling card. And it's not very well known in the West, but it actually is very well known in the East if you look at church history. But the journey I'm about to take you on will go through topics of history, of art, of medicine, of science, and of faith. So it should have something that will interest most of you. And obviously for me, since I have a background in physics, the science part's what I'm most excited about. So I'm going to talk about it whether you like it or not. So that'll be exciting. Next slide. But just to give you a sense of what the shroud looks like, this is what it looks like. The shroud was a linen cloth. It's a linen cloth about 4 meters long, about 1 meter wide, and it wrapped Jesus' body after he died, after he was crucified. And we hear about it for the first time if you go to the Gospels. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, talks about how after Jesus died, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a very wealthy man, actually gave this cloth to the followers of Christ to bury Christ. And then we hear about it again in John chapter 20. And that's what I'm going to turn to. I'm going to go to John chapter 20. I'm going to start in verse 3. And actually, I'll start in verse 1 just to give some context. Early in the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb. She saw that the stone had been moved away from the entrance. This is after the resurrection. And ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. And that's obviously John, who wrote the book. They said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, she said, and we do not know where they have laid him. So Peter and the other disciple set out and made their way to the tomb. They ran together, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and reached the tomb first. He peered in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not enter. Then Simon Peter caught up with him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the napkin that had been around his head, not with the wrappings, but rolled up in the place by itself. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. Until then they had not understood the scriptures, which showed that they must rise from the dead. Now it's interesting because what happened there? Well, first of all, when it talks about the linen wrappings, what it's referring to? It's referring to the shroud, which was a burial cloth, and also it's talking about a chin band that was around the face of Christ. There was a chin band that held the jaw shut, and there was also bands around other parts of the body. So those are the linen wrappings. And it's interesting because if you read the Greek, it talks about how the word look and examine is almost like a scientist examining the evidence. And what happened is he saw something. And it talks about he saw something, and then that struck belief in his heart. And the question is, what did he see? Well, again, this again is a representation of the shroud. It's a painting that was done in the Middle Ages, just to show you a depiction of it. Next slide. But this represents the actual Shroud of Turin. This is an actual picture of the shroud. Now, you'll notice that there's these black lines on the top and this black line on the bottom and these 8 black patches. That was not part of the original shroud. What happened was the shroud in about the 15th century was in a fire, and it was in a silver box, and the box melted and burned straight through the shroud, and it was folded in 8 pieces, which is why there's those patch marks. So those were sewn in layers, so ignore those. But what you'll notice on the shroud, which was there since the beginning, is a lot of medical evidence. There's blood stains, there's body serum that's there, there's evidence of contusions, of puncture wounds, and the like. And we'll talk about those in a bit of detail. Also, there's a very faint, ghostly body image. It's not from the medical evidence. It's a mysterious image which was produced by a very mysterious source. And I'll talk about that also. So what I'll do is I want to first begin and talk about the history, then I'll talk about the medical evidence, and then go to the more physical evidence, and then talk about the significance of it. Okay, next slide. First of all, let's talk about the history. Well, the Gospels end at that point, and they talk about the shroud no more. What happens if you go through church history, there's lots of documents that talk about the Shroud of Turin. One of some of them include if you remember the history of Eusebius, he refers to certain pieces of the evidence. There's the Chronicles of Edessa. There's a lot of other legends. But if you piece it all together, you can form a very consistent historical picture. And if you're curious about the details, there's a book called The Shroud of Turin by Ian Wilson. That's Ian Wilson. That'll go through this in great depth. And I'm just going to give you a quick sketch. Well, what happened is in Eusebius' History of the Church, it talks about a letter that was written by a king at that time. And the king's name was King Abgar V. And he was in the city of Edessa. And Edessa is the city that you see in the middle, far towards the right. And what happened was the king had leprosy. So the king sent a letter to Jesus asking Jesus that he would come to Edessa and heal him of his leprosy, which was probably some sort of skin disease. It may not be the leprosy we know of today. What happened, obviously, was Jesus was too busy. But what happened is after the resurrection, one of the disciples, perhaps Thaddeus, took the shroud, the burial cloth, and took it to the king of Edessa. Now, at that time, burial cloths were not the most gracious gifts. They probably wouldn't be great for today either. So what happened was the disciple folded it up like a painting and put a picture frame around it so it looked more like a painting. Well, they showed the shroud to the king, and what happened is as the king heard the gospel and saw the image, the king was healed of his leprosy. So not surprisingly, the king became a Christian. and declared Edessa the first Christian city. So what happened was the king went outside the city, and there's always in all the cities of that time, every city had its own god that they worshipped. Like if you remember from like the god of Artemis is worshipped in Ephesus, and in Athens it's Athena. Well, this city had its own god. So what the king did was he smashed the god, and he put a copy of the face of Christ on the city gate with an inscription that said something along the lines of, "Bow down to Christ, he who trusts in him will not be disappointed." And there's a reference out of the book of Isaiah. So what you see, which is very significant, is right from the time of the resurrection, people understood the deity of Christ. And that's significant because if you go to your typical secular university and take a Bible class like I did, they'll tell you that the idea that Christ was divine was something that was made up much later by the church. But we have very clear evidence that the church understood his divinity right from day one. Well, what happened was the image remained, the shroud remained in the city for several decades, but the king of Edessa's son became the next king, and he was not a Christian. So he started to persecute the Christians. So what the Christians did was they hid the shroud above a niche in the city gate so that it wouldn't be destroyed by those that were hostile to the faith. And it was lost to history for several centuries, and it falls out of history. But then it reemerges around the 6th century when a disaster strikes the city and it's rediscovered. And at that point, it's called the Holy Mendilium. So if you study the history textbooks, it's referred to as the Holy Mendilium. What happened if you study the artwork at that time, the icons of Jesus then look exactly like the face of the shroud at that point and forward. Well, it stayed in the city for several hundred years, but eventually the city fell into Muslim hands. So the Muslims captured the city and captured the shroud with it. Eventually, a few centuries later, is the Holy Roman Emperor who was residing in Constantinople that you see in the middle of the slide. He sent an army, and the army surrounded Edessa for several months and then offered a huge bribe, and eventually the city of Edessa gave the shroud to the Byzantine emperor, or the representatives of the empire. So he took the shroud back to Constantinople, and it remained in Constantinople for several centuries. In fact, that's the point where it's actually taken out of the picture frame and it's seen as a full shroud. So at that point in history, you actually see the whole image of Christ, both front and back. Well, eventually, a few centuries later, the knights during one of the Crusades went from Europe into Constantinople, and they sacked the city, as you're probably familiar with from church history, and they took a lot of the artifacts, including the shroud, back to Europe. Well, it was hidden in Europe for about a century and a half later in the family of Duchesne, the Duchesne's family, and it was reemerged in about the 14th century, and that's where modern history talks about the shroud. And eventually the shroud moved from France to Italy, and eventually it was willed to the Catholic Church, so it's currently owned by the Catholic Church in Turin, Italy, in one of the churches there in a bulletproof glass with argon gas protecting it. So that's a bit of a history, and that's I think, rather interesting. What's also very interesting, though, is not just the history of the shroud, but the history of the image. Next slide. Because what this picture represents are the trade routes that connect Edessa to many of the other cities in the modern world, or in the ancient world. And Edessa was on a major trade route. So what happened is when visitors would go to the city of Edessa, they would hear the stories of Christ, and they would copy the image from the city gate and take it with them wherever they went. So the image of the shroud was copied and reproduced throughout the ancient world. In fact, it goes out radially from Edessa further out over the next few centuries. Well, what happens is pretty amazing. Next slide. Because a remarkable transformation in art takes place at that time. Because if you look at the images of deities at that time, they were always shown in profile, meaning to the side. So you see the deity from the side, very distant. Now, why was that? Because the pagans of the time thought the deities were very unconcerned with human affairs. They might talk to a king on Mount Olympus, or to a noble person, or to a Herculean-type figure, but they wouldn't talk to your average person. So the image of the deities was shown as very distant. But what happened was, as the pagans heard about a God who was close to them through Christ, who came to earth, as they heard about the love of Christ, as they saw the supernatural miracles, as the Christians were healing the sick, they wanted to copy those ideas and put them on their own gods. So what they did was they reproduced the image of Christ's face onto their deities. Next slide. So what you see is the first frontal image of a god at that time was copied off of the face of Christ. And that might seem odd to you, but if you think of it this way, imagine how teenagers today like to dress up like Britney Spears or wear Michael Jordan shoes because they think by doing so will give them that same charisma or that same proclivity for sinking baskets. Well, at that time, the people thought if they would copy the face of Christ onto their own deities, then perhaps their deities would gain the same power to heal the sick as Christ. It didn't work, but it was a reasonable idea. Well, at any rate, if you follow the images of deities from that point forward, you see that they are more and more, further and further out, are copied from the face of Christ. Next slide. In fact, if you look at the first depiction of Buddha in physical form, was copied from the face of Christ. Because when the Christians went to India and started to preach the gospel, the idea of a God that loved them, the idea of an afterlife was very attractive. So what happened is when they portrayed Buddha, they portrayed him with the face of Christ. In fact, you see the same elongated beard, the same elongated nose, the piece taken out of the beard. And if you superimpose the images, the lines match up so closely there's no question that this image was produced from the Shroud of Turin. Next slide. Well, I mentioned how the shroud was hidden from history for several centuries and then rediscovered in the 6th century in Edessa. Well, again, what you see at that time period is the artwork, the icons of Christ, again at that point, were copied right from the face of Christ. Now, that's not surprising, because although in the Western Church we're fairly iconoclastic if we're Protestants, but for the Orthodox Church, icons are very significant. They think they're of equal value practically as Scripture. So they would no more whip up an image of the face of Christ than we would write a different gospel. So when they created their icons of Jesus, they were meticulous about copying every detail from the Shroud of Turin on their icon, whether it was a painting or a coin. Next slide. In fact, here is an icon from the 6th century. It's called Christ the Pantocrator. It's found at a church at the foot of Mount Sinai. And what you find, those little red lines represent curves or shapes that exactly correspond on the Shroud of Turin. It's where they line up exactly. And on this particular icon, there's 170 what are called points of congruence. That's, again, points where the lines and curves match up. And a court of law takes about 60 points of congruence to prove that the image is exact. So we know for a fact this was copied from the Shroud of Turin. Very significant. And then, of course, the image, you see it in the catacombs and churches and so forth. So that's a bit of a history of the image of the shroud. But now let's take a turn and go from the artwork into the medical evidence. Next slide. Because again, what you find is if you read the Gospels, you find a lot of medical details given about what happened to Christ. He was crucified. He was struck in the face. He carried a cross. And what you find is every single medical detail shown on the Shroud of Turin exactly matches what's described in the Gospels, and vice versa. Very significant. Next slide. In fact, if you go through the front of Christ, here's the frontal image of the shroud. You'll see everything from bruise marks on the cheek to contusions on the knees to the spear wound to the scourge marks. Next slide. And the same on the back. You see scourge marks, you see puncture wounds, and so forth. But let's look at the medical details in a bit more detail. Next slide. Well, if you've read the Gospels or at least seen the Passion of the Christ, it talks about how Jesus was scourged. And what a scourge was a handle with 3 leather straps, 2 or 3 leather straps. And on those leather straps, there were pieces of metal or bone. In fact, if you happen to see the movie, when the soldier hit it against the table and tore off a piece of the table, that was very, very accurate. So when a person was scourged, the wounds the scourge would rip pieces of flesh out of the body. So the way it was depicted in the movie was actually quite accurate. Next slide. Here's an image of the back showing some of the contusions on the back. Next slide. And here's an image of the front of the shroud. Now, what you see on the front of the shroud is you see little dumbbell-shaped wounds, sets of 2 and 3, that exactly match what you'd expect from a Roman scourge. In fact, they could tell that there was 2 soldiers that scourged him. One was taller, one was shorter, and the shorter one was a bit more vicious than the taller one. Now, what is different in the movie is there are no wounds, scourge wounds, around the heart, because Roman soldiers would never scourge a person around the heart because they would be fearful of killing the individual. And scourge wounds are not meant to kill an individual, but just to injure them and put them in a great deal of pain. Next slide. Well, also, if you recall, Jesus had a crown of thorns placed on his head. And a crown of thorns had thorns which were about 1 inch long that were razor sharp. They were like pins that were deeply pushed into the scalp of the individual wearing it, of Christ who wore it. Next slide. And what you see on the shroud, both on the back of the head and the front of the head, is you see puncture wounds with blood flows that exactly match what you'd expect from a crown of thorn puncture wound. Next slide. Also, if you recall, Jesus carried the cross. Well, in Mel Gibson's movie, he showed Jesus carrying the whole cross, which is what church history or church tradition has. But more likely, if you study the Roman methods, he only carried the crossbeam. So he probably carried the crossbeam on his back. And again, on the shroud, you see contusion wounds that exactly match what you'd expect from a person carrying a heavy object on their shoulders. Next slide. In fact, the way crucifixion worked was that the Roman soldiers would take spikes the size of railroad spikes and hammer them through the wrist of the individual. Now, the gospel talks about how it was through his hands, but the Greek word for hands actually includes the wrist. And we know from history it had to be through the wrist to carry the weight. So the spikes went through the wrist in what's called the space of disto. It would hit a nerve. It would be incredibly painful. And that's what would hold the individual on the cross. And the same thing would happen to the feet. Next slide. And if you look on the Shroud of Turin, you see a wound through the wrist, and you can actually tell which bones it went next to that exactly match what you'd expect from a Roman crucifixion. You also see blood stains, and the blood stains are at different angles, which is significant because when an individual is on a cross, they're in a twisted position so they can't breathe. So the person had to actually pull themselves up by the wrist to breathe, which was incredibly painful. So you see blood stains which match the person lying on the cross like this and pulling their arm up. So that exactly matches what you expect from a Roman crucifixion. Next slide. Again, you see the wound through the feet. Next. And also, if you recall from the Gospel of John, which is very significant because the Gospel of John talks about how after Jesus died, the Roman soldiers punctured his side with a spear and blood and water came out. And what's interesting is that's the point where the Gospel of John says, I am an eyewitness who saw that. Very significant. Well, what you see in the shroud is you see a separation of blood and body fluid, exactly as described from the Gospels. So what we see, in conclusion, for the medical part, is we see that every single detail described in the New Testament is perfectly represented on the Shroud of Turin, which shows very conclusively that the Gospels are extremely reliable historical documents. Because again, if you go to your typical university, they'll tell you that the Gospels were made up much, much later and just a lot of fiction, not very reliable. But we see independent confirmation of their extreme reliability and extreme accuracy. Next slide, please. Well, that's the medical evidence. We're going to switch now, and we're going to talk about the body image. Because what happens is the Shroud of Turin was actually photographed. Next slide. Around the turn of the century. And what you see here is a shroud and then the photographic negative. And what was found is the photographic negative actually looks more clear, at least on a very good slide, than the shroud itself. So the Shroud of Turin actually acts like a photographic plate. So this is very interesting. At least a lot of scientists sought this. So a team of scientists went to Italy and studied the shroud for over 100,000 accumulated hours, which makes the Shroud of Turin the most studied object on Earth. And what they found was that the image was not produced by paint. It was not produced by paint pigments. There's no backing material. They found that the image was produced by radiation. It was produced by a very high voltage form of radiation. Well, that's not all. Next slide. They also saw something that was very, very strange. Because what people did was they modeled what it was like for the shroud drape over the face and the body of an individual who was crucified. And what they also did was they measured the density of the image on the shroud. That's the dots, the number of dots per inch that you see on the shroud, like a printer. And they found that the density of the image on the shroud corresponded to the vertical distance from the cloth to the body. In other words, if you imagine drawing a straight line vertically, like you see that vertical line, from every point on the face or every point on the body, that vertical distance from the face to the cloth corresponds to the density of the image. That indicates that the image had to be produced by radiation, because when radiation goes through air, it attenuates and the image becomes less intense. That's really weird. That's not supposed to happen. Because what seemed to happen, that's the scientific terminology, it's weird, but what happened was it's almost like there was millions of little lasers on the face of Christ, on the body, that shot up and produced an image on the shroud. That's not supposed to happen, because typically radiation doesn't go out linearly, but it radiates out. Like if you light a candle, the radiation goes off in all directions. It doesn't shoot like a laser beam in one direction. That's physically impossible. So the image on the shroud is essentially physically impossible to take place. Next slide. And this was really confirmed because the Shroud of Turin image was put through what's called a VP8, which is an image scanner used by NASA to plot landing sites. And what they found was this is the vertical relief where the vertical distance is representative of the density of the image. And again, you see this amazing three-dimensional face. Next slide. And that's what gives the shroud this really peculiar property, is that if you actually take the image of the shroud and superimpose it with the photographic negative and slightly offset it, it creates a three-dimensional image like so. This very eerie three-dimensional image. And I'll call that a three-dimensionally enhanced version. Now, if you look at this, you see the extraordinary features, but also notice those buttons that appear to be in the eye. Like if you look at the right anatomical eye, you see a button. Now, why is that button there? Well, that was a very interesting question, and what happened was this was studied very carefully by Dr. Wanger, and he found that those buttons in the eyes were actually coins. And what those coins do is the coins actually reveal the type of radiation that was produced during the resurrection, and they reveal the date of the shroud. Now, how is that the case? Now, that's significant because who here is familiar with the carbon dating of the shroud? Who's heard about the carbon dating? Okay, maybe we'll just skip that section. Well, let's just say the Shroud of Turin was carbon dated. Next slide. Next slide. Next. And this is an image of the carbon dating that was the 1988 sample, and the shroud was actually dated to about the 13th century. So people thought it was a fraud for a long time. Next slide. But what this is actually the images from the video of the shroud the sample being taken from the shroud. Now I want you to notice how there's a seam running through the sample that's being taken for carbon dating. Well, what happened was when the shroud was carbon dated, they didn't actually date the shroud, but they dated the shroud with the contamination of a seam that was put in there much, much later. So the carbon dating was pretty much refuted. Next slide. Also, what's interesting is on the shroud, away from the body, there's actually images of flowers. Next slide. And there's also pollen on the shroud. And the images of flowers and the pollen correspond to only one place on Earth, and that's Jerusalem. So because of the evidence from the flowers and the pollen, because of the poor sample, people know the carbon dating was mishandled. I just wanted to mention that, even though you hadn't heard about it. That's okay. Next slide. But back to the show. Well, what happened was Dr. Wanger examined the image of the shroud over the eye very carefully. And he found that the image over the eye was actually that of a coin. Next slide. And they found it was an image of what's called the lepton of Pontius Pilate, was minted around 29 AD in the area of Palestine. And the resurrections, took place around 30 AD. So we know the shroud can be dated back to about 30 AD, very reliably. And also what's very significant is this image of the coin shows us what type of radiation was there. But before I mention that, you may be asking the question, why were there coins in the eye? Well, what happened at that time period is if a person died in shock, like today, their eyes would remain open. So what Roman soldiers would do is they would close the eyes and they'd put coins or pieces of pottery over the eyes to keep them shut. That's why there was coins in the eye. Next slide. But what this represents is the image over the eye. Now you might see the letter CAI in the upper left corner. Next slide, and let me show you that more carefully. Who sees the letter CAI? Okay, so those letters CAI on the shroud exactly correspond to the letter CAI on the coin. The coin actually is a coin dedicated to Caesar, and that's part of the spelling of Caesar. So we know it's the lepton of Pontius Pilate. What's also significant, though, is the images, the areas of the coin that left images on the shroud were the areas that were jagged or raised or somehow irregular. Now, what's immediately obvious, well, at least if you have a PhD in physics, is that that indicates that the image was produced by what's called a coronal discharge. Now, that may be a big word that you haven't heard lately. Next slide. But perhaps you've seen this. Who's seen these little electric bulbs? The way they work is you charge up the center of the bulb to a very high voltage, and then if you put your fingers there, it shoots little electric shocks, little electric bolts, because the voltage difference ionizes the air and you have an electric current. Well, that's the radiation that produced the image on the Shroud of Turin, this coronal discharge, at least the best that we can tell. We don't know really what did it, but that's what's the best we could tell. Next slide. And this was actually tested by a physicist named Zimmermann out in Germany. And what he did was he took a coin similar to the lepton that was in the eye of Christ, put it between two metal plates with a linen cloth, and he charged the thing up and actually got a similar image. But what was discovered through this test and others is to get an image on the cloth, you have to get the voltage just right. So for Jesus, that was about 100 million volts of electric voltage. You have to get the timing just right. It has to be about 1/10 of a second. If the voltage is too high or the timing is too quick, it burns the cloth. If it's too low or too slow, it doesn't leave an image. So that's roughly about a lightning bolt. So that's significant because it shows us that the image of the cloth is not an accident. It had to be left behind deliberately because the parameters had to be so tightly refined. Next slide. Well, that's one form of radiation. That's, in a sense, the electric discharge from the surface of the body. But Dr. Wenger discovered a second type of radiation produced during the resurrection, because he discovered that if you look at the wrists of the hand on the shroud, they don't correspond to hands, but they correspond to the bones in the hands. So the image on the shroud is actually an X-ray image of the skeletal system of Christ. Next slide. Now, if you look on the left side, that's the image of the shroud in the three-dimensional enhanced mode with the plus and minus image superimposed and offset. The image on the right is simply a skeleton out of a medical textbook. Now, if you look very carefully, the images are the same. So what you see on the facial image of the shroud is actually the skeletal features of Christ. You see the jawbone floating under the beard. You see the teeth, the roots of the teeth, the sinus cavities, the nasal cavities, the orbitals of the eyes. So again, we see more evidence of an X-ray or what's called an audio radiograph. Well, that's odd. So what would do that? Well, what's important to realize is this is impossible to explain scientifically because it's very hard to reproduce resurrections. It's hard to get funding for that sort of thing. But what we can do is make a best guess. So what would cause this? Well, if the atoms in the body of Christ, if the strong nuclear force was overcome and the neutrons and protons separated, what would happen is the electrons would then go to the surface of the body and produce the coronal discharge. Then the transition of the electrons through different orbitals would produce the X-rays. So essentially, it's like a weak dematerialization. The body essentially dematerialized. Well, how much energy are we talking about? Well, that would be like a small nuclear bomb, essentially. That's what it would take to make this happen. So again, how do we explain that? That doesn't typically happen when people die. Well, again, this is where science ends and faith begins. So, if you're a Christian, what do you have? Well, you have a Jewish individual with a crown of thorns, with a spear wound in the side, who was crucified, who around 30 AD suddenly dematerialized and vanished, producing lots of energy. Well, that kind of sounds like the resurrection. In fact, you can even tell from the medical evidence that the body vanished between about 1 to 2 days after the fact, or about 2 to 3 days after the fact. So it's right around the third day. Well, what if you're not a Christian? Well, there's other explanations. Some have explained it in terms of aliens or time travelers or the Starship Enterprise or something like that. But for those not inclined to accept those type of definitions, it's very, very hard to explain. So the question is, why is it here? Why is it significant? Why am I telling you this? Well, again, it's significant for several reasons. But let me just kind of give you more of a personal story. Like for me, as I mentioned, I just wasn't going to believe without help. And I think although God kind of likes people to have faith, that's a good thing, God kind of looked at me and said, he's just not going to make it. Let's give him a little bit of help. So, and that's fine, because that's a lot like Thomas. In fact, I want to go back to the story of Thomas after the resurrection. This is John chapter 20. And let me just continue to read this. This is starting at verse 24. It says, one of the 12, Thomas the twin, was not with the rest when Jesus came. So the others kept telling him, we've seen the Lord. But he said, unless I see the mark of the nails on his hands, unless I put my finger into the place where the nails were, and my hand into his side, I will never believe it. A week later, his disciples were once again in the room, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them, saying, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here, look at my hands, reach your hand here, and put it in my side. Be unbelieving no longer, but believe. Thomas said, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, because you have seen me, you have found faith. Happy are those who find faith, even without seeing. There were indeed many other signs that Jesus performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. these written here have been recorded in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that through his faith you may have life in his name. Powerful, powerful story, because what happened was Thomas was a good empiricist. He wasn't going to believe just by hearsay or personal testimonies, but he wanted to see the evidence. He said, I will not believe unless I see it for myself, unless I touch the wounds in his hand and the wounds in his side. And that makes sense, because Thomas was a twin, right? So Thomas was probably always confused with other people. So he probably thought, hey, they probably saw somebody else that looked like Christ, and it wasn't really Christ. So again, as a good empiricist, he was considering all the options and said, I just can't believe that easily. What's interesting is Jesus appeared to Thomas. And what Jesus didn't say is, shame, 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 faith is blind, just believe. And I mean, he didn't say that. What happened was Jesus actually allowed him to touch the wounds in his wrist and the wounds in his side. He gave him that empirical evidence he desired. And that's kind of the nature of the Christian faith. Because to become a Christian really is a step of faith, of surrender, of transformation by God. But once that step is made, God will meet us rationally. Because God doesn't want us to have a blind faith that is completely irrational without rhyme or reason, but he wants to help us understand intellectually why it is satisfying. Now, all of us aren't necessarily PhDs in physics, so all of us aren't quite so empirical, and that's fine, because God, in a sense, will meet us in whatever way fits us. For some, it's being touched by his emotional love, his compassion. For some, it's the beauty of the faith. For some, it's the philosophical significance. For others, it's different reasons. But whatever it is, whatever it takes for us to be confident in the truth of the faith, God will give us that confidence. That's the promise. Well, the second thing that's significant about the shroud is it reminds us of the implications of the resurrection. Because I think a lot of people think, gosh, there's many ways to God. I mean, as long as you're sincere and so forth. And it's very tempting. I'd like to believe that. But what's significant is when Jesus was about to die, he said, Father, if there's any way you can prevent this from happening, please do so. And he said that more for our benefit than his. And the answer was no, you had to go to the cross. So Jesus had to go to the cross and die for our sins to somehow reestablish our relationship with God. And that's significant because it shows us the absolute essential nature of the crucifixion and resurrection. The next thing is significant. It shows us the nature of the Christian faith. Because if you look at the evidence from the shroud, it was an incredibly violent and painful death. All the powers of this world, the people with power, with money, with influence, with prestige, all teamed up to destroy Christ. And he went to the cross and died for those that hated him. That's a significant picture of the radical nature of God's kingdom. Because being a Christian isn't a matter of just saying, okay, I'll follow some nice moral rules and I'll believe a few things, but it's a matter of us following a radically different way of life, a different kingdom with a different destiny. And finally, what's significant is it reminds us of the power of the resurrection. Because there was a disciple named Paul, or a later Christian named Paul, who said, the same power that rose Christ from the dead is the same power that works in us. And it's sad how many Christians see the faith as kind of a drag, as kind of irrelevant. But the reality is the faith is meant to be something where the power of God, that's a lot of power. That's 100 million volts plus a nuclear bomb raising Christ from the dead. That's the same power that's in our life that wants to transform us and empower us to transform the world. Thank you. I wanted to give a few corrections and clarifications for the talk you just heard. I had mentioned in the talk that there was a fire in the 15th century which caused the scorch marks on the shroud. It was actually a fire in the 1500s. I also mentioned that Dr. Wenger had discovered the coins in the eye, but they were actually discovered by Francis Phyllis. Dr. Wenger simply used his photo image overlay technique to confirm that the coins were in fact the coins that Francis identified. The lepton of Pontius Pilate. Also, just to clarify, the original dating done on the shroud was from the 13th and 14th century was what the dating said. But what happened is that dating has been pretty much discredited because there was a couple papers out, one by Ray Rogers, one by some Italian scientists, that have both shown that the material used in the sample that was dated was actually contaminated with fibers from much, much later. I'd also mentioned the physicists had done research on linen that had confirmed that the type of radiation produced during the resurrection was something like a coronal discharge. His name was actually Schuermann. Just to give a few more clarifications, I had talked about Eusebius, whose history of the church had mentioned the story of the king in Edessa His story is known to have certain elements that were not completely historical. However, every detail I mentioned that's relevant to the shroud has been confirmed independently. For instance, I'd mentioned that the face of Christ from the shroud was copied onto the first depiction of Zeus in frontal view, and that depiction was done in 31 AD in a city uh, near Edessa. And there was enough similarities between that image and the shroud to confirm beyond reasonable doubt that it was in fact copied. Also, some people often questioned about the lay of the shroud. If it laid over Jesus' face, the question is, would that have distorted the image if radiation left vertically? Well, what happened was there's actually a lot of flowers and other objects beside Jesus, so the shroud actually rested relatively flat over his face, which is why the image is not very distorted. Also, the coin I mentioned, I talked about the letter CAI that were identified on it. Actually, that was a misspelling of the words Tiberius Caesar. Usually Caesar has a K instead of a C, but that coin actually had a misspelling, which is why there was a C. Also, people often ask about the Jewish burial customs because most of the burial customs at that time, they washed the body for burial. However, when an individual died violently and there was blood on the body, they would not wash the body because the blood was seen as sacred, and that's why the body wasn't washed. Also, I wanted to mention some additional resources. The research done by Alan and Mary Wanger is in their book entitled The Shroud of Turin, An Adventure in Discovery. Also, you can find more information in the book by Ian Wilson entitled The Blood in the Shroud, and by Mark Antonassi, The Resurrection in the Shroud. So I hope that information proves helpful. Thank you.